All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are virtually zooming in from. Thank you so much for being here today. We are in for a special treat. Anytime that we have Dr. Green here is just an absolute delight. And thank you so much, AG, for being here. On our last day of the conference, I just wanted to thank you, of course, for being here, but also a reminder that we have all of the sessions that have been recorded. They'll be on the conference website. If you click on sessions and then on demand at the home screen, you'll be able to view all of those. So without further ado, I have to say, I'm so thankful anytime that AG says yes. And normally we would be, in session either in January or July. And when Clinical Psychology Week would kick off, remember my first week 10 years ago, and this incredible human being got in front of everybody and started doing a cheer for fielding. And so I'll never forget that first time meeting you, AG, and the energy that you bring and just incredible wisdom and insight. So thank you so much for being here this morning. I appreciate you. And I'm going to go off camera, and Mike, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Hillary. All right, well, uh, just as a nod back to those days of in person, give me an F. And you say,
Yeah.
F. That's the
Yeah.
fielding cheer.
Ah,
Yes. Of course, you don't want me to give you an F. You would rather have an A. And so that is part of the irony of the fielding cheer. So let me get started by sharing my screen. As you can see, this is a discussion about what I'm referring to as the Intersectionality Olympics. And to introduce myself further, I have been core faculty with the clinical psychology program since 1994, so quite a few years. Fielding's been good to me. I have a lot of respect. So whenever there's things that I can participate in, particularly involving DEI, I want to be there. So what I want us to think about and talk about today is how to meaningfully and respectfully engage when we're having dialogues about inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, i.e., IDEA conversations. Because of the nature of wanting to be represented at the table, whenever we have these conversations, there is the propensity for them to lead to ever widening circles of inclusion. What about people who don't grow up in America? What about this group? What about that group? And while that is consistent with the principles of inclusion, it becomes a little unwieldy to yield enough floor time, and there becomes this kind of competition for trying to represent and present these varying perspectives. And because there's always these intersecting identities in the room, this kind of group will join together and this group, and so it just kind of feels like team competition. And I'm wondering if there is some way to keep it from degenerating into that. I am referring to it as the Intersectionality Olympics as opposed to the Oppression Olympics, which is another term that has been referred to in the literature for this competition. But I think that to connect with different features of our identity does have some positive properties. So it's not always a negative thing, which is what the Oppression Olympics seems to imply. But there's both positive and negative of everyone being in this race for social justice together. So I am going to posit some understandings that I think can help us to engage, things that we can use for ourselves when we're joining these conversations. And also, maybe the insight will help us to allow others to engage in a meaningful way without going into the freeze mode of shutting down or shutting the other person down or just disengaging altogether. So, hopefully, together we can shape some thoughts to move us from merely describing what good intergroup dialogue looks like to something more prescriptive about how do you do this in a real way. I'm not suggesting that I have the answers or a specific model to propose, but just some thoughts that I've gathered from some of the available material out there about this. And feel free to stop me to engage. I've got a couple of charts that I want to review to give us some context, but we'll definitely have a session afterwards. So, uh, Lindsay Brahman is one of the uh, authors whose work I feel has been really relevant to this exploration on my part. And first, to put it in context, it is stressful to try to talk to others about inclusion and diversity and equity. Why is it stressful? Because we exist in a world where we know that there are competing tensions. We don't have equity. We don't always have inclusion. And so, whenever we bring up these topics, those tensions are inherent in the conversation. So, when we're in these stressful conversations, you should recognize that you're going to have reduced tolerance during those stressful times. So, what does that mean? This idea of the window of tolerance is this sweet spot between feeling shut down, where you can't engage, or so activated that you blow up and overpower everyone else in the conversation. But in that learning and listening mode, that's the window of tolerance. And so, how do we get to be there? How do we get to stay there when we're having these stressful conversations? That's the question to explore today. To say a little bit more about this window of tolerance, it has to do with our level of physiological arousal, which gives us kind of a clear handle on assessing where we are. So, this is the window of tolerance is when our nervous system is regulated, we feel like we are able to cope with the adversity that's presented to us. So whatever the triggers that are occurring in the conversation, we feel that they're not overactivating us, and we can respond calmly and rationally. If we're not adequately engaged, that is, we are kind of feeling afraid of this conversation, we don't really want to go there, it's hard to gather our thoughts, um, it seems like we've been talking about this forever and we're not getting anywhere, it's making me feel sad and ashamed and disengaged. That's that freeze response. I'm not activated enough. I'm not feeling capable enough to engage in this conversation. On the other extreme, what has been said or is being said has triggered you into this fight or flight response where I can't let them get away with that. My emotions are kind of going out of control, haywire. I'm feeling really anxious about being here. I'm activated and angry by what they've said. I can't let go of it. I can't let them get away with it. I can't let them continue believing that. I'm not really being rational and impulsive about how am I going to get my point across. I'm just being overwhelmed with the need to resist this situation. I'm flooded with all these emotions. I'm not able to intentionally communicate. And so, in between those two extremes is this window of tolerance where I hear you, I'm connected with where you're coming from, even if it's a different place than where I'm coming from. I'm calm, but I'm engaged. I'm wanting to understand you and make sure I get it right. At the same time, I can help myself to understand that you being who you are is not necessarily a threat to me. We can coexist having these two different perspectives. I'm rational and reasonable. I'm not demanding anything of you. I'm not demanding anything of myself. I'm just listening and learning. And so the challenge is just to stay in the moment and to hear what is being said and to try to respond from an authentic place. So that's where the conversations can really be helpful. They can be enlightening. There can be an equal exchange. But too often we find ourselves catapulted into one of these hypo-aroused states or hyper-aroused states. So, in order to be able to manage this level of arousal, there are some things that Dr. Berman recommends that you keep in mind. That living in this society that we live in, no matter who you are or what your identities are, there's going to be some repeated trauma because of the inability of us to have been inclusive, equitable, diverse, and our struggles over time have resulted in this complex trauma. And it's not just a particular identity, but multiple identities that experience this. So there's a likelihood that everyone has some identity that has been othered, and there's the history of trauma that you bring to the conversation. So, knowing what your triggers are, what your history is, having a good understanding of how you came to be traumatized in the way that you are around these topics helps you to be mindful, grounded when you're challenged with belief systems that activate your trauma. So, what are some skills that we know from psychology can help to manage these levels of activation? So, we're trying to maintain as much as possible our level of activation in this window of tolerance, in this optimal state. So, if we are too activated, then we need to use mindfulness, grounding, breath work to bring us back to this window of tolerance. We can focus on the unclear thoughts, the emotional distress, and do some self soothing to bring us back into that window. The same with hypoarousal, when we're shutting down because we're unable to engage with the negative affect. We use that mindfulness of our insight into the etiology of this reaction and do some activating work to get us a little more engaged. Maybe some physical activity to help activate our system so that we have a little more energy to address this avoidance response so that we can re-engage in some way. This emotion map, it represents our ability to do kind of a self-assessment, to do an inventory of what we're feeling. And we can actually recognize this in a somatic way in our bodies. Where are we feeling warm and activated? Where are we feeling shut down, dark? Maybe not even being able to feel certain parts of our body. And from uh, images of levels of activation, we know that different emotion states represent different levels of activation in our body. And so we can learn to recognize what emotions are being activated and how might we bring those into the conversation in a way that lets people understand what our reaction is, and to share how what they are saying is impacting us. And that kind of communication, as opposed to simply reacting to it, can help keep us connected and in that proper window, that proper mindset. So here's another illustration of what happens when we shift to the threat-based mindset instead of the learning mindset. So in the learning mindset, it's more fluid and less rigid, non-linear. You can listen and absorb some things, and then you can do some processing internally, maybe interacting with your physiological activation to then share something out loud with the rest of the group, which you then listen and learn from their reactions to you. And it's a very organic, interconnected process. But once we hear that information and we respond to it as a challenge, as some kind of threat to us, then we go into fight or flight or freeze mode. And the fourth is fawn. So once there's a threat, we have to figure out how are we going to respond to this threat. The options are we can resist it by fighting. And that is, what you're saying is wrong, is inconsistent with how I see the world. I have to prove that you're wrong and I am right. Not good for conversation. The flight response, okay, you're talking out of this world. I can't relate to what you're saying. Let's just change the subject. I don't even want to try to understand what you're saying. The freeze response, so I don't know how to even respond. This is too scary. I don't want to upset you. I don't want to be upset. I'll just do nothing. And then the fawning response is, okay, well, that's really interesting what you're saying, and I really like these parts of it, and I'm going to take that home and reflect on it later. But it's only surface level engagement. It's kind of okay, I'm going to appease you for now, but I don't really want to think about this. So if we can recognize when we're operating from one of these threat-based mindsets and try to move back into the learning, listening mindset, that will help the conversation. Now here's an example from Kai-Cheng Tom, who's another writer in this area, about an example of knowing perspective when you go into the conversation. So there are some things that we all presume to be true from our worldview. We may entertain the possibility that there are also alternate truths, but we have our set of truths. And so this was his map of some of his core truths, or their core truths. And the two categories are that the cancel culture doesn't exist because there are true injustices and consequences are necessary in order for change to occur, and you can't erase the consequences of that injustice. And his other core truth, or their other core truth, is disposability is a real problem. That people cannot just be ignored or thrown away because they're not valued by others. So there are several core truths that they represent associated with that. And in the middle of those core beliefs results in this mandate that they must demand justice. So some things that come with this set of beliefs is the possibility of encountering another set of beliefs that are contrary. And when that happens, how then do you engage those beliefs? Similar to the challenges to threat, he has mapped the possibilities here. So if you respond to challenges to your core beliefs with this destructive conflict or fight or flight response, your mindset becomes I must destroy the other or be destroyed. If I let these competing thoughts exist, it will annihilate me. And so then that's why extreme measures, extreme statements, dehumanizing ways of communicating seem legitimate and necessary from that point of view. I'll skip the window of transformation and go to the performative change, fawning or submitting. So I'm overwhelmed by my insecurity and shame. I'm not sure if I can represent my point of view. So let me just make some commitments I can't keep. I'm gonna try not to ever do this in the future, even though I don't really understand how I was wrong. Or if I tell you how I really feel, then I'm going to lose my sense of dignity or sense of belonging to this group. So I have to. My relationship with accountability looks a lot like codependence. So I just want to be seen as a good person. So I'll say whatever is necessary. And then the fragility response. I just feel like such a victim, or I feel like I'm going to be bullied in this situation because I feel like you're really just highlighting things that you think are wrong with me. So I'm just this. I don't know what to do to make it better. But if we go back to that window of transformation, just making some presumptions about people's motives can change. What you're saying is not a disrespect to my beliefs or my boundaries. And it's okay for me to ask questions about how you see the world without feeling that it has to be your way or my way. I want to be accountable for my own reactions. I want to grow. And I want to accept these challenges joyfully. I want to welcome the ability to understand someone who sees things different. I want to be curious. I want to make sure that my basic needs are being supported and cared for, but I want to also provide that. And I want to feel safe enough to be able to integrate what your needs are into the situation. So that's where we're trying to get to in these conversations. A question for the group: how do we reach the window of transformation and allow others to reach it when we have these conversations? So I will stop sharing and invite your conversations. Hi, Sherry. Katrina, you joined while we were talking.
Hi, AG. Great to see you. Sorry to be late.
No problem. So I welcome any reactions or thoughts at this time.
A lot of this fits also with the trauma-informed practice or the trauma-informed pedagogy frameworks, which I think also help us identify when we're in that zone where we can engage versus when we're in the zone where we're frozen or reactive. And I don't think we can self-identify unless we have a sense of like what's going on with our bodies, the somatic stuff we were talking about. And so I use the trauma-informed model a lot with my students because I want to destigmatize when you aren't receptive, when you have to. So like I'm in Texas, and so we had Roe v. Wade and then a school shooting, like, and those affect us very directly. And so I know that I'm not in a place to like deeply challenge myself right now. I'm raw, as are many of the people in my community. And so in my approach with my students, I want to destigmatize when you're not in a place to engage so that when you are, you can fully engage. And I think that's a challenge with my student population. They're pre-med, they're very much like power through. And it's a very different population than I was with at Fielding or at other universities. So I love these models, and I love the idea of finding that sweet spot and just being really brutally honest with yourself when you're not in it, so that you don't do harm through performativity or self-harm through like secondary traumatization. So yeah, all those models are great. And I love the Lindsay Brayman graphics. I have to go find all the ones we use now. They're so good.
I'm trying to post the slides in the chat, so I'll figure that out in a minute. But yeah, polyvagal response theory, it's all the same language of being able to assess your somatic states so that you can manage them, not be ashamed of them, use them as data to add to the conversation. Other thoughts?
Hey, AG, it's Marie Sonnet. Nice to see you.
Hi, Marie.
Hey, I was thinking this was just so timely for me. I just had a very difficult conversation with my sister, and not sure it ended very well. But the challenge of managing one's own window while another window is being presented with equal passion or response. So I'm not only managing my window, but I'm trying to interact with yours, and so that both of us will calm down. So thoughts about the dual nature of the conversation.
Right. Yes, so I think that is really key for us as change makers, that it's not enough just to manage your own reaction in the conversation to move it forward. That being really receptive to what is happening, being responsive to what is happening with the other person, that's the true facilitative skill. And so to have those difficult conversations, there is the need to know yourself, but also to be able to use your ability to perceive how the other person is receiving you to help move the conversation forward.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sometimes the performative is what that other person needs in that moment
Yes,
to help them calm down.
Exactly,
Though,
exactly. Yeah, it's not the ideal.
It's not the best time to do. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, AG. Didn't mean to interrupt. I was very curious. Thanks for this presentation. I'm curious what you just said, and Marie, your experience. It sounds like sometimes we have to move through as both participant and observer, right? And I think I was thinking when I was looking at the framework in particular that sometimes even in your own responses, you're operating into one or two of those frames, right? Like trying to intentionally be in the transformative frame, but maybe you're in the victim frame or some. I mean, it is interesting because there's sort of multiple levels going on in the conversation. And to your point, Marie, are you also thinking about how you intentionally move the conversation? Whether you're successful or not is another thing altogether. But
Exactly.
you're trying to get them out of certain frames into others.
Exactly. Thank you for understanding.
Go ahead, Sherry. You're muted still.
I'm
go.
really loving this conversation and this subject that you brought forward to us, AG. I had an experience while teaching a university class last year, and where two of the students, on Zoom, of course, where two of the students became very angry with each other, and they were enraged, and each of them were escalated, and they were yelling in the classroom at each other. And there were about 12 students on my Zoom screen. And my most dominant reaction was that I wanted them to stop. I wanted them to stop. I wanted them to stop yelling and screaming at each other and calling each other names, etc. And I came up with a way to do that, and which included some having the group do some processing on their own, not talking with anybody else, including with me, but all of us doing some private writing about what we were thinking, what we were feeling, etc. So, and there's a long story about what transpired over the next few weeks as a result of all of this. I then presented that as an example in a workshop that I and someone else were sharing with, presenting with the faculty of our university, Antioch University, Santa Barbara, about engaging in these sort of events. And a critique that I received suggested that I was coming from my whiteness about not being able to wanting things to be more orderly and to have no strong emotions occurring. Of course, I moved into some performative place in that moment. I definitely relate to, I'll do anything to be good again, as one of the lines that I just saw in one of your slides. So I am interested in hearing any thoughts any of you have, AG, beginning with you, if we could, about that. I mean, I'm not unfamiliar with, of course, with what white supremacy is about. What do you think?
So, yeah, my first thought is I would imagine it would be necessary for you to first manage your reaction during that, because obviously that feedback is going to be inconsistent with how you view yourself in that moment. And so being able to suspend the reaction. I think my internet connection is a little unstable.
Yeah.
But maybe it might sound So it'll be okay in a minute.
Okay.
So I think first, bracketing your natural tendency to defend yourself. I think that some self-compassion would say it's probably natural for me to feel defensive here.
Mm-hmm.
So let me bracket that for a moment so that I can try to stay with the intention of the person who shared that information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then I would probably say, contrary to my impulse, what I should do is acknowledge that that's how they see me. And I think that that's not going to be natural for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that would be a selfless act of allowing them space in that moment to share with you how they are perceiving you, despite this knowledge internally that that's inconsistent with how I want to be seen or how I see myself. So first, thank you for sharing how you see me. I might even then share how it feels to hear that.
Yeah.
Without denying it or negating it. This is how it's feeling for me. 1 second, please.
That's helpful.
Sherry, that's so interesting that you would bring that up, because I was kind of waiting for a place in the queue. I have thoughts about that too, and this idea in whitedness about comfort at all costs.
Yes.
Yeah, and so that's where I was going to kind of ask for some group intellect.
Yes. Good. Thank you, Christy. Yes. I feel seen and I feel heard already. And I feel, AG and I know each other quite well for many years. And so I feel held by
Yes.
AG as well, which is something that I like to feel.
Well, everybody likes to feel that, Sherry. So that's why I was saying that would be my first prescriptive response, is to help that person feel heard and accepted for what they're sharing. Then my reaction to it, how it's feeling for me. And then if it seems helpful, to share how it felt for you. What, where, and that may not be helpful in every situation. You don't have to explain yourself, but it may be enough just to say thank you for sharing that, and this is how it's sitting with me, and step back. Other thoughts about Sherry's question?
Well, Dr. Green, it's Christy. When you stepped away, I just filled a little air space. I was going to come to the group in a related query. It's something I have a tension with a lot in conversations around racial conditioning and the work that I do with the Center for Healing Racism here in Houston. And just last night I had heard a phrase I hadn't really thought about quite that way before. The fact that I am whited instead of white, maybe whited, and I'm sitting with, I kind of, it is interesting. I'm trying to decide whether that's a cop-out whiteness thing or if it's more accurate. I mean, I get the description, but one of the things he described was this, the speaker talked about was this whitedness characteristic of a need to have comfort at all costs. And I struggle with the need to always create psychological safe spaces, brave spaces, safe spaces. I think about when people are othered or brutalized, nobody creates a safe space for them before they brutalize someone. And so as people who are thinking about their own growth, thinking about their own self-discovery, their own journey, how to communicate that we might do all of these things, but is the paradigm, is that a colonized paradigm that white people need this? Because other people in all kinds of diversity don't necessarily get that luxury. So that's the thing that's just keeps swimming in my head. I can't find a place for all of it.
Thank you for that question, Christy. That is one that I think many of us struggle with. How inclusive do we want to be of quote unquote white people's feelings in these conversations? And me, I feel like a position of radical perspective taking is to try to understand everyone's perspective, even the white supremacists. And I get a lot of pushback, especially from other people of color. Like, I don't want to understand that. I have no desire to connect with that. But then I am of the mind that, at least in an abstract sense, they are equally unresponsible for having been indoctrinated in the way that they have been, and they believe this to be true because of that indoctrination. So the radical perspective taking position says, try to get into that mindset of, if you believe that your people are being threatened by the existence of other people, then you might have some radical reactions to that, including violence. And so, well, saying, okay, don't kill people, that's a low bar to expect of everybody. Yes, but if you don't really see any other means, then maybe it's not such a low bar. And the same with whiteness. Is there room for compassion for people who are being attacked for this attribute that has all of these privileges that they are not really necessarily responsible for? I think that there is not a best practice. It's very individualized. So in some spaces, I think, yes, it's very compassionate and appropriate to make space for white comfort and fragility. And in other spaces, I smash it with a sledgehammer. It just depends on the space.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to be pointed to some literature. I'm going to look up radical perspective taking and yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
One of the arguments I've been trying to make in writing about white fragility in Texas right now, especially around things like education in K through 12 and their access to books written by people of color, is that discomfort is not trauma. But if you are not used to feeling discomfort, it may feel like trauma, right? So I've written some pieces that have gotten a lot of traction from Black communities, but then I have white dudes showing up and telling me that making a white child feel uncomfortable by teaching them an age-appropriate version of the history of slavery in America is going to traumatize them, as opposed to thinking about the entire community of children and how being seen and understood may override the discomfort of other kids. And so I'm just curious if you have anything to sort of add about how you tease out the difference between trauma and discomfort. People can have like really extreme views on this. I tend to see it as very gradated. But in my own work, learning to tolerate discomfort right? To have that middle space, not be me feeling perfectly at ease and wonderful. It's me being challenged and maybe feeling some guilt and discomfort, but being okay with just sitting with that for a while is what I'm trying to sort of exemplify for my white students, for example. So how do you, I mean, I think we're sort of talking around the same thing we've been talking about, but do you have any thoughts about how we define that line between trauma and discomfort? When do we push people into their discomfort a little bit more? And when do we ease up to avoid trauma?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So I think that there's probably a clinical answer, and then there's kind of the layperson's answer. I feel that from a clinical perspective, the difference between trauma and discomfort has to do with the degree of dysregulation. That in a trauma response, I feel like my internet's dysregulated again. Um, but in a trauma response, there's such a degree of dysregulation that there's some dissociation from the reality of the here and now moment, and that it's really difficult to do accurate processing when your system is dysregulated. You're not really responding to the stimuli in the environment. Whereas with discomfort, I think there can be an acute awareness of what's happening in the moment and some upregulation of the system, but you're not overwhelmed, you're not totally blanking out. And that for me is the difference. If a person is still able to process and engage what's happening, then I think it's okay to continue exploring that discomfort. But when there's a trauma reaction and they don't seem to be responding to what's happening in the moment, then I think it's time to help them to soothe.
One thing I would say about being in that space is that if I identify what I'm feeling for other people, they can stop for a minute and identify it, especially when I've worked with younger people. I'm feeling uncomfortable. So how can we deal with that? Because they're not used to saying, oh, I'm uncomfortable, oh, I'm traumatized. It's always, for the population I work with, it's generally from 0 to 60. They're either fine and calm or they're exploding. And teaching them how to talk about the uncomfortableness and identify it so they have time to process it. And when I've tried to have hard conversations with other people who are white, I also try and do that. If I identify this makes me uncomfortable, or this is how I'm feeling, it helps them also process. Right. So by being a model, it helps me in those difficult conversations. And then if that doesn't help, then I know they're not in that place where they can grow, which has also been an issue with people in my community.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are simplified versions of some of the charts that I demonstrated. So you could just use the colors, for example, in checking in with people. Are you feeling green now? Are you feeling yellow now? Are you feeling orange or red now? To help them to express how activated they're feeling in the conversation, and then adjust your next steps accordingly. But preparing them to understand that they might have these kind of reactions, and that's expected, and that we're interested in helping them to manage it and using that as a way of them signaling for us when things are getting out of control. And this is based on the predication that we are wanting to facilitate these conversations. Sometimes we have to acknowledge when we're in the freeze mode, even at the expectation or anticipation of such a conversation, and it might be necessary to share that information. This is not really a good time, or I'm not in a good space for this conversation, as opposed to feeling obligated when you're not ready. You want to say a little more about those rules, Sherry? What kind of rules do you expect as the teacher?
Mainly, I'm coming from a teaching philosophy and a belief, various beliefs that and I'm hoping that I'm helping to co-create with my class, with my students, a space where everyone is able to hear and listen and remain present and participate and engage. And as a result of my experience last year with this, and more so with this conversation, I'm more conscious of how doing for some isn't doing for all. Obviously, given our diversity across all identities.
Mm-hmm.
So I am feeling a bit stumped about that, and that would have been a cool thing for me to share with the room.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, and to invite their conversations, their what they have to say about that.
So, something that comes to mind in reaction to that, Cherry, is the presentation by Four Arrows about decolonizing the curriculum and how the colonialist thinking is very authoritarian and rule enforcing,
Mm-hmm.
whereas the indigenous thinking is more fluid and let's process what happens as opposed to making rules to prohibit things. And so that might apply. I was thinking about the rule that there's no yelling.
Yeah.
For someone who feels heard by saying it strongly, that would be limiting, maybe even excluding.
Yeah.
And so just the idea of saying you have to do this or you can't do that, that's more imperialist, colonialist. And so you might think about how you might phrase that that's more inclusive.
Yeah.
Even though your intent is to make it safe for everyone. Yeah.
Right. The
rules are
impact is,
difficult.
and that's not the impact on everyone at all. Yes. Thank you so much. I think that Marie, what you shared about, doing the both and is what was missing for me, not just then, but of course since this is who I am, I'm certain, I know that this is what I create in other situations as well. I, as an alum who's been out of the quote the classroom as a student as formally identified as a student for a long time, I really miss this kind of process and session that we're having right now, and appreciate everyone's input. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sherry. It couldn't happen without you and those like you who are here.
Everyone here. Yep.
Are there other thoughts that anyone would like to share?
I just really appreciate that while your work is obviously incredibly research and data informed, that it's also very concrete. Sometimes I get really frustrated when everyone's just like, we're gonna love our way out of this, and I'm like, that's great. But you know, all the different frameworks and all the different ways of presenting the psychological reactions that we have to being challenged are so helpful, and really give me something to draw from when I'm in new environments and I'm changing careers soon. And so I just super appreciate all of that data, because it's the best of fielding to me is a combination of this overarching commitment to social justice, but also like real strategies. And so I appreciate that you encompass both of those.
Thank you. I was trying to make it more boots on the ground. How do we do this prescriptively as opposed to describing what needs to happen? Yes, if we could just get along, if we could just respect one another, but how do you make that happen in real life? Well, I guess we don't have to stay for the next half hour if we have gotten what we have needed. Is that correct, Hillary? I appreciate all of you being here. Go ahead, Christine.
Could I bring another thought? Because this is such a wonderful a group to think with. Last night at an event, a speaker, after the event, just kind of engaged with him and a couple of people, one young Black activist and the old white guy who was giving the talk about what white men need to do to solution the racial and where we are, and got an overarching sense of from both of them, well, it's just going to take little incremental things, and we're having little incremental moments. And I was with a group of people who are, let's find, where's the sledgehammer? To sledge through the wall. This sense of acceptance of the little incremental, and how do we use the tools that, if young people seem to have a greater appetite, it seems like out there in the ethos right now that young people seem to have a greater appetite for looking at the discomfort, looking at the whole issue. Mm-hmm. What tools are we using that they use? Are there places in Twitter or TikTok or whatever to get some message that could move this faster, to somehow engage faster? Anybody have any thinking about that? Or am I in left field?
I wish I knew where the movement was happening. I would go there, but I think it is both and, that we have to try to influence one mind at a time, and we have to use things like the political system to change laws. So I think it's both and. I don't know about social media. That's someone in a different generation who could speak to that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that the social media piece is constantly changing. I did my dissertation on the psychodynamic function of online aggression, and all of us who've been in that space have just watched it mutate and change so quickly. So I think social media has an incredibly important role in activism, but so does misinformation. And so it's changing so fast. Even those of us who research it have a hard time nailing down. We can't say it's all good or it's all bad, or the good outweighs the bad, or the other way around. But I do feel like social media has given a lot of us opportunities to perspective take with other people's lives. So like when I came back to teach in the fall after George Floyd was murdered, a student said, I learned more from TikTok this summer than I ever learned in college. And I was like, same, right? And so the tokenism that we often expect, the labor we expect of people who are disabled or queer or Black or whatever, is not necessary, and shouldn't even be required in a world where they're voluntarily talking about their lived experiences in public spaces. And so that's one side of social media that I see as incredibly positive, and that ability to sort of expand your range of schemas over your view of the human experience through following people from really, really different life experiences and backgrounds and cultures from you is incredible, and has a real impact on how you process information in the real world. So that's my yay social media speech.
Okay, yeah.
Misinformation is a whole other thing, and I don't study that, but it sucks.
Thank you.
The one thing I would say is that if people don't practice the change, they lose the change. So like, I live in Washington, D.C., and for a long time, I worked in Ward 7 and 8, and I got very comfortable in that space. And then because of certain events, I left and ended up back in my mostly white space and had to then switch back. And I had to relearn some of my, I guess, what I would call my good development. And I had to repractice that because in another space, I didn't have to be as mindful. And even though I had been doing it for years, I had been in Southeast, I had good relationships with my students. I work in adult foundational and secondary education. So then when I went away and came back, I said, oh, I've fallen back into my old bad habits. And so you can learn a lot from social media, but if you don't practice, if you don't go out and find community, you don't really change, in my opinion. And so you have, to me, it's both, it's that think globally and act locally, and each one teach one, except we need to do each one teach at least 10 or 100. So it spreads a little faster. The Black Panthers, wasn't that who said each one teach one? We have to spread that more, and it's on us to do it.
You're so right. If we don't put it in practice, it's just words.
And I actually remember the event that happened to me that helped me see from a different lens when I was working with a scout troop. And I was the only white person in the room. And one of the parents came up and talked to me and talked about their son. And I said, which one is yours? And she said, oh, the light-skinned one over there. And I looked, and suddenly my vision changed. And I realized what she meant when she said the light-skinned one. And up until that point, that didn't have a lot of as much meaning to me. And that was a big shift for me. And I remember that. And I'd been working with those kids for 6 months. Parents had said that to me, but I got it that day. And such a little thing was very profound.
Mm-hmm. You don't know what you don't know until you know, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I guess you could have been felt some embarrassment for not knowing,
Oh, yeah.
but fortunately, you took it as a learning moment and grew from that.
Well, like I said, when I was open about what I was feeling to the people around me,
Mm-hmm.
they forgave a lot of my missteps. And I was very lucky to receive that kind of forgiveness for my misunderstanding and my and misinterpreting a lot of what was going on around me. And I would ask, and if they said, "Oh, you should know that," I was fine. But very often they took the time to explain stuff to me. And so I was very, very lucky. And it was being vulnerable that helped me grow.
Mm-hmm.
Now I've got to figure out how to help other people do that.
As you grow, as you said, once you know better, you do better. So I think we are winding down here. Last opportunity for any additional thoughts. Welcome, Kathy. Well, thank you for being with me and engaging in this question with me. Hopefully, there are some thoughts that you will carry forward in doing this work, remembering to modulate your own engagement, learn from your body as it speaks to you, pay attention to the signals that you're getting from the others in the conversation, try to help them to manage their level of arousal so that we can keep as many people as possible in that window of transformation and openness to others. Thank you for all of the sharing today. And Hillary is going to be emailing you the handout for reference after this session. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day, everyone.